By the time his lawyers arrived at the vault, it was empty. Not ransacked. Not forced. Empty. And not one person in that building, not the CFO, not the legal team, not the board, could explain how. Except for one woman. The one nobody had ever thought to ask. Hyunwoo Jang did not build his empire by being careless. He built it by being precise, about who mattered, who didn't, and who would never be allowed to know the difference. For $1 billion. Tech holdings across Seoul, Singapore, and Dubai. Real estate structured through entities that took investigators 3 separate warrants just to name. His inner circle was small. Male. Well compensated for their silence. Uniform, in ways that went beyond resume lines. Men who moved through rooms without being questioned. Men whose authority was assumed before it was proven. Simone did not share that advantage. As a black woman in rooms built long before she entered them, she understood early that competence would be expected from her, but credit would remain optional. He trusted no one outside that circle. And he was right not to. He was simply wrong about where the circle ended. Simone had worked for him for 6 years. The official title was executive assistant. In practice, she was the architecture of his day. She drafted the contracts he signed without reading. She scheduled the calls he couldn't be seen taking. She sat in every room, every negotiation, every private dinner, every closed session. His colleagues called her efficient. That word, efficient, is what men say when they mean present but not relevant. She understood that. She had understood it from the first week. There was a meeting, international partners, full board, cameras from a financial press outlet that Hyunwoo had personally approved. A figure in the presentation was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Structurally wrong. The kind of error that changes what a deal looks like to the people being asked to fund it. Hyunwoo caught it mid-sentence. He paused, looked at the room, and then, without hesitation, without lowering his voice, without a single moment of consideration, he turned toward Simone and said the error was hers. It was not hers. Everyone in that room who had been paying attention knew it was not hers. Nobody said so. Simone did not flinch. She did not correct him. She did not look down. She simply held his gaze for exactly 1 second, and then returned to her notes. That was the moment. Not the beginning of a plan. The confirmation of one. Here is what 6 years of invisibility actually buys you. Not comfort. Not loyalty. Not even respect. Information. Simone knew the names of every shell company Hyunwoo had structured since 2019. Not because she was given access to them. Because she routed the documents. Because she scheduled the calls. Because she booked the flights for the lawyers who built the entities that held the money that was never supposed to be found. She knew which emails he deleted himself. The ones he didn't trust even his own IT team to handle. She knew which calls made him stand up and walk to the window. She knew the difference between the voice he used when a deal was closing and the voice he used when something was already wrong and he needed it to look like it wasn't. 6 years. Every tell. Every pattern. Every seam in the architecture. She had not been collecting it. She had simply been present, while everyone assumed presence required no attention. It had started in her 2nd month. A routing slip, 3 transactions, 3 different entity names, all bearing the same 4-digit internal code that appeared nowhere in any organizational chart she had ever been given access to. She filed it. She noted it. She said nothing. And she began, from that point, to watch for the code the way you watch for something you were not supposed to see. The investigation began quietly. The way these things always do, not with sirens, but with a single phone call that changes the temperature of a room. A $200 million discrepancy. Offshore holdings. 3 jurisdictions. Regulators who had been watching a pattern of transactions that almost made sense, almost. Hyunwoo knew before the formal inquiry landed. He always knew. Paranoia, at his level, is not a flaw. It is infrastructure. Within 72 hours, he had his legal team restructuring entities, moving assets, rerouting capital through vehicles so layered that tracing them would take years. If you were starting from the outside, he worked fast. He worked precisely. He worked with the focus of a man who had done this before and believed he would do it again. And he used Simone to do it. Not by telling her. By using her. Document routing, she handled it. Calendar blocks with attorneys whose names were listed only as initials. She scheduled them. Private car bookings for men she was never introduced to. She arranged them. He handed her tasks. She completed them. That was the transaction, in his mind. That was all it was. What he did not consider, what he had never once considered, was that every task she completed was also a data point. Every unsigned name, every unusual routing, every jurisdiction that appeared once and was never mentioned again. Simone began keeping a second record. Not in the company system. Not on any device he owned or monitored. Her own record. Her own structure. Built in the margins of what she was authorized to see, using only what she could observe, document, and verify. She was not angry. She was precise. Because this was not about what he had done to her in that boardroom. That was one moment. This was about a pattern she had watched him run for years. Against regulators, against partners, against anyone who trusted the surface of what he showed them. She wasn't building a case. She was building a map. Not for revenge. Not for exposure. She had watched powerful men fall loudly and rebuild quietly. What she wanted was insulation. Independence structured so completely that no one like him would ever again decide whether she was necessary. The question, the one that would not be answered yet, was who she was building it for, and when she planned to use it. Those answers were not in any document. They were not in any system. They were held quietly by a woman who had learned that the most protected information in any empire is the information the emperor doesn't know you have. The Financial Crimes Unit arrived on a Tuesday. No announcement. No press. Just 3 people with credentials and questions, and the particular stillness of investigators who already know more than they're showing. Hyunwoo's inner circle responded the way men respond when the structure they built to protect them suddenly feels like a wall closing in. His CFO began working nights. Not because there was more to do, because there was more to remove. His legal team went to retainer silence, the kind of silence that costs $40,000 a month and says nothing that can be used in a courtroom. The office, on the surface, continued normally. Meetings were held. Calls were taken. Hyunwoo moved through his building with the controlled ease of a man who had survived scrutiny before. But the temperature had changed. Everyone felt it. Simone was interviewed on a Thursday afternoon. Conference Room B, standard procedure. One of Director Park's junior investigators ran through the questions: employment history, daily responsibilities, document handling, communication protocols. Simone answered everything. Clearly. Completely. Without hesitation. At one point the investigator paused on a specific date, a calendar block from 11 months prior. A private car booking. For hours. No destination logged. He read the entry back to her and asked if she remembered the purpose of the booking. She said she remembered it clearly. She said it had been a medical appointment, Mr. Jang's, rescheduled twice, which was why the block was irregular. She said she could pull the original scheduling correspondence if it would help. He said that wasn't necessary. She returned to her water and said almost nothing else of value. Almost. Director Park reviewed the transcript that evening. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, not for what was said, but for the shape of it. Every answer had landed at exactly the boundary of the question. Not beyond it. Not short of it. Exactly at it. That is not how nervous people answer. That is not how people with nothing to hide answer. That is how someone answers when they have decided, in advance, precisely how much to give and to whom and when. Director Park had interviewed hundreds of witnesses in 20 years. She recognized the architecture. She also recognized, on the third read, that the date of the calendar block the junior investigator had flagged, the one Simone had answered so precisely, did not match any medical record in the documents they had subpoenaed. She had checked. She requested a second meeting. This time, she came alone. No junior investigator. No recording protocol. No official designation on the calendar entry. Not because she trusted Simone. Because she did not trust the room. If Simone was holding something significant, logging it too early would bury it under procedural drag before it could move. She came as director of the Financial Compliance Authority's Asset Integrity Division. She came as what she actually was in that moment, a woman who had just recognized she was not the only one playing at this level. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. No transcript exists. What is known, from a single source, unverified, never confirmed, is that at some point during those 11 minutes, Simone placed a drive on the table. She did not say, "I have evidence." She said, "I know where everything is." There is a difference. Evidence is something you hand over. Knowing where everything is, that is something else entirely. That is a position. That is leverage. That is the difference between being a witness and being the only person who can read the map. Director Park left the building through a side exit. Simone returned to her desk. Nobody saw the exchange. Nobody knew what was on the drive. That question, what was on it, would not be answered for another 3 weeks. Something shifted after that meeting. Subtly. The way pressure shifts before something gives way. Hyunwoo's CFO, a man who had never once acknowledged Simone beyond the functional, stopped meeting her eyes in the corridor. Not avoidance. Something closer to recalibration. His lawyer, who had CC'd her on nothing in 6 years, began including her on email threads she had no operational reason to receive. Small things. Careful things. The behavior of men who have begun to suspect that the person they overlooked is now closer to the center of something than they are. Hyunwoo noticed the shift. He was too sharp not to, but he read it wrong. He assumed the investigators had flagged Simone as a liability, a loose thread, someone who had seen too much without the loyalty structure to keep quiet. He made a decision. Clean separation. Severance package. Restructuring on paper. The kind of exit that looks administrative and means, "You are no longer useful to me, and I need you further away." He did not attend the meeting. He sent HR. Simone listened to the HR director present the terms. Severance. Reference letter. 30 days of transition. She listened to the entire presentation. And then she smiled, not with relief, not with surprise, not with the particular performance of someone trying to seem composed. She smiled the way people smile when something happens exactly when they expected it to. She accepted. Immediately. Gracefully. Without a single counter. She signed the paperwork before the HR director had finished explaining it. By the end of that afternoon, the CFO knew what had happened. He sat in his office for a long time after. Because he understood something that Hyunwoo did not yet understand. A person who fights termination is someone trying to hold a position. A person who accepts it without flinching, without negotiating, without threatening, without even pausing, is someone who no longer needs the position. Which meant she had already moved to wherever she was going next. Which meant she had been ready. Which meant this, all of this, had already been decided. The only question left was what, exactly, she had decided. 3 weeks after Simone cleared her desk, Hyunwoo Jang's primary holding company was frozen. Not flagged. Not under review. Frozen. International accounts suspended. Real estate transactions across 4 markets halted. Liquid assets locked behind an order that his legal team had 48 hours to contest and no viable ground to contest it on. His CFO called it a containment failure. His lawyers called it an acceleration of the existing inquiry. Both were wrong. The freeze did not come from the original investigation. It came from a civil fiduciary breach filing, submitted with asset flow analysis detailed enough to trigger immediate cross-jurisdiction restraint protocols under international compliance agreements. The complaint named no public accuser. It did not need one. It demonstrated structural exposure risk. That was sufficient. By the time his attorneys understood the mechanism, correspondent banks had already propagated the freeze. Reversal was no longer procedural. It was political. This is the moment everything that came before it has to be reconsidered. Not adjusted. Reconsidered. Simone had not begun building her record 3 weeks before the freeze. She had not begun it when the original investigation opened. She had not begun it after the boardroom. The record, the secondary structure, the documentation, the pattern analysis, had been in construction for 2 years. 2 years before regulators identified the $200 million discrepancy. 2 years before anyone outside Hyunwoo's inner circle had begun to ask questions. She had seen the pattern first. Not because she had access others didn't have. Because she was paying attention while everyone around her operated on the assumption that she wasn't. She watched the transaction rhythm. She observed which entities appeared in document routing and then disappeared from all future correspondence. She tracked the jurisdictions. She noted the timing, which restructures happened in the months before regulatory cycles, which transfers occurred in windows that left the least observable trail. She did not have a law degree. She did not need one. She had something more precise. 2 years of uninterrupted observation of a man who believed that what she saw did not count because of who she was. And she waited, not for the right emotion, for the right moment. The moment when the investigation was already open, when his team was already reactive, when the noise around him was loud enough that one additional pressure point would not look like an attack, it would look like consequence. The drive she gave Director Park contained no stolen documents. It contained no privileged information she had taken without authorization. Every item on it was either publicly observable data, the kind available to anyone willing to spend 2 years looking, or internal documents she had been explicitly authorized to handle as part of her documented role. She had broken nothing, violated nothing. She had simply done what no one thought to do, or believed she was capable of doing. She paid attention. She structured what she saw. She waited until it mattered. And then she walked it into the right room at the right time in the right hands. The trust had been completed 14 months before the freeze, filed correctly across 2 jurisdictions. But the trust itself was not the mechanism. The mechanism was the trigger. 18 months earlier, his attorneys had embedded contingency clauses into multiple restructuring documents. Automatic asset transfer provisions designed to move exposed capital into compliant holding vehicles if regulatory thresholds were met. They drafted them as insulation. They did not scrutinize one fallback vehicle closely. When regulatory triggers are activated, the clauses execute exactly as written. The assets moved where the documents directed them to move. Processed, in its final form, by a paralegal in Hyunwoo's own legal team, as part of a larger document package that Simone had prepared, organized, and submitted for execution. The paralegal had processed 43 documents that week. The trust was item 31. The beneficiary designation was on page 9 of an 11-page instrument. Nobody flagged it. Nobody was looking for it. Why would they be? She had prepared the package. She was authorized to prepare it. She had simply understood, more completely than anyone who handed her the task, what the package contained. Within 48 hours of the freeze, investigators began pulling at the threads of Hyunwoo's asset structure and found something that did not match any of their existing models. The shell companies were unraveling. That was expected. What was not expected was where the assets inside them had moved. Not offshore. Not liquidated. Not distributed to known associates. They had moved into a trust structure. Clean. Compliant. Properly filed across 2 jurisdictions. The kind of structure that takes months to build correctly, or longer, if you are building it while no one is watching you build it. The trust listed a silent beneficiary. One name. Nobody in the room recognized it. The attorneys looked at each other. The investigators ran it through their systems. The CFO, when shown it, said nothing for a long time. Director Park recognized it. She had seen it once before. On a severance agreement, signed 3 weeks earlier, by a woman who had accepted her termination without hesitation, without negotiation, without a single question about what came next. Because she already knew what came next. She had known for 2 years. Simone was not the witness. She was not the informant. She was not a loose thread or a liability or a woman who had simply seen too much. She was the beneficiary, the silent one, the unnamed one. The one whose position in the structure had been built, document by document, routing decision by routing decision, using the mechanics of Hyunwoo's own legal architecture, executed by his own legal team, who had processed it without ever understanding what they were constructing, or for whom. He had used her hands to build the instrument of his own undoing. He had handed her the tools. He had given her the access. He had routed everything through her because she was efficient, because it never occurred to him that the person processing his documents was also reading them. The room went very quiet when Director Park explained it. Not the quiet of confusion. The quiet of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about who had been in control of this situation and from what point. She didn't take his fortune. She didn't steal it. She didn't intercept it. She didn't redirect it through deception. She simply understood, earlier than anyone, more completely than anyone, where it was going to go when the structure around it collapsed. And she made sure that when it landed, it had somewhere to land that had her name on it. His lawyers built it. His documents funded it. His decision to fire her completed it. Every move he made in the final weeks, including the one he thought was protecting him from her, was a move she had already accounted for. His legal team had one question. Not where the money went. They knew that. They needed to know one thing. Was it reversible? Hyunwoo's legal team spent 72 hours looking for the fracture. The point where she had overstepped. The document she had taken without authorization. The communication that crossed a line. The transaction she had no right to touch. They found nothing. Not because they weren't thorough. Because there was nothing to find. She had not forged a single document. She had not accepted a payment. She had not solicited a bribe or filed a false instrument or misrepresented herself to any authority at any point in the entire 2 years she had been constructing this. Every step she took was either authorized, observable, or both. She had operated entirely within the boundaries of what she was permitted to do, and had simply understood those boundaries more completely than anyone who drew them. His attorneys had no case against her. What they had was the specific, airless frustration of men who had been outmaneuvered by someone they had never once considered a threat. The press covered it extensively. Financial crime at this scale does not stay quiet for long. Not when the names attached to it are known in 3 markets. Not when the asset freeze touches real estate in cities people recognize. The coverage was thorough. The coverage was detailed. The coverage named every executive, every entity, every jurisdiction that had touched Hyunwoo's structure on the way down. Simone's name appeared in none of it. Not once. Not as a witness. Not as a source. Not as a footnote. She was again invisible. This time entirely by architecture. She had not spoken to journalists. She had not positioned herself as the person who brought him down, because that framing would have required her to be seen. And she had spent 6 years learning exactly what it cost to be seen by the wrong people at the wrong time. She did not make that calculation twice. The empire did not collapse cleanly. Empires rarely do. It restructured, under new oversight, under conditions negotiated by attorneys working on behalf of men who were now focused entirely on minimizing what they personally stood to lose. The CFO reached an agreement. 2 of the senior executives accepted terms that kept them out of criminal proceedings in exchange for cooperation that was, by all accounts, extensive. Hyunwoo's legal exposure was significant enough that the proceedings would continue for years. Director Park did not stay in her previous role long enough to see the end of it. She was promoted 4 months after the freeze, moved into a position with broader mandate, larger jurisdiction, and the kind of institutional authority that follows a case everyone will study for a long time. She gave no interviews about Simone. She was never asked directly. And on the one occasion a journalist came close to asking the right question, she said only that the case had benefited from exceptional attention to detail by people whose contributions she was not at liberty to discuss. Simone was never charged, never subpoenaed, never named in any filing, any proceeding, any public record connected to the case. The trust structure was examined, validated, and left intact because it had been constructed correctly within the law, using instruments that his own legal team had processed and approved. There was no mechanism to undo it that did not also require proving she had done something wrong. And she had not done something wrong. As for where she is now, that question was asked. By journalists. By people connected to Hyunwoo's former circle. By at least one person inside the investigation itself, speaking off the record. The answer, consistently, was the same. Nobody knew. Not her former colleagues. Not the HR director who had processed her severance. Not the building staff who had seen her every day for 6 years. She had left the way she had always moved through that office, without disturbance, without a forwarding address anyone could verify. The most protected thing she ever possessed was not the drive, not the documentation, not the trust. It was her own location, her own next move. The fact that even now, even after everything, she remained exactly where she had always been in that building, out of reach. There was one moment. A corridor. A legal building. Afternoon light through glass. Hyunwoo was leaving a deposition. Simone was arriving, with Director Park, whose promotion had been announced the previous week. He saw her first. He stopped. The way people stop when they encounter something their body recognizes before their mind has finished processing it. For a moment he looked like what he actually was, a man who had built everything on the assumption that he could see every threat coming, who had been wrong about one thing, once completely. She did not stop. She did not slow. A single, professional nod, clean and brief. The nod of someone completing a courtesy they have no particular feeling about. And then she looked away, and kept walking. He stood in that corridor and watched her go. For the first time in 6 years, he looked at her, actually looked, with the full attention he had given to rivals, to cameras, to anyone he had ever considered worth the weight of his regard. He finally looked. She had already looked away. Hyunwoo Jang spent 30 years learning to dominate rooms. He never learned to read them. He never asked what Simone wanted. He never asked what she noticed. He never asked her name in full. Not once in 6 years, not even when she was the only person in the building who knew where his next meeting was, who was in it, and what was actually at stake. That was not negligence. In his world, it was policy. The invisible don't want things. The invisible don't plan. The invisible are safe, manageable, containable, useful in the way that furniture is useful. He was wrong. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one demanding to be seen. It is the one who decided, long ago, quietly, without announcement, that being overlooked was not a wound. It was a weapon. And she sharpened it every single day she handed him his coffee, scheduled his lies, and waited. Nobody stole his fortune. No one broke in. No one deceived him in any way he could point to in a courtroom and name. She simply stood in the room long enough to understand that power, real power, does not announce itself. It does not need the room to know its name. It arrives, and by the time you realize it's there, it has already rearranged the structure.